What if the timeline you were taught was never stable to begin with, only reinforced by repetition and convenience? Evidence pulled from dust, bone, and genetic code now presses against the seams of the official story, revealing a human past that is older, wider, and far less orderly than textbooks ever allowed. Skulls with modern faces appear where they should not exist. Tools demanding planning and chemistry surface long before culture is supposed to awaken. Genes inside your own body whisper of encounters with other humans who were never meant to be there. This is not a tale of steady progress, but of overlap, loss, survival, and return, where civilization does not begin once, but many times, often after forgetting itself. Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button and prepare for the revelations to come. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. And as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself, and let's dive in. The idea that modern humans appeared once, in one place, and then swept cleanly across the planet, was never born from certainty, only from the absence of better evidence. For decades, Africa was presented as a single cradle, a point of origin around 200,000 years ago, from which a fully formed species radiated outward, replacing all others in neat evolutionary succession. It was a story that felt orderly, almost comforting, because it implied direction and inevitability. That order began to fracture the moment archaeologists started uncovering remains that simply refused to stay in their assigned time slots. In the scorched landscape of Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, layers of sediment long thought irrelevant yielded something unsettling. Beneath stone tools and ash lay human skulls with faces that would not look out of place today. The brow ridges were reduced, the jaw shape familiar, the cranial volume indistinguishable from our own. When thermoluminescence dating was applied to the surrounding material, the result landed like a shockwave, roughly 300,000 years. This was not a minor adjustment to the timeline. It pushed anatomically modern humans back by an entire geological heartbeat and placed them in North Africa, far from the supposed evolutionary epicenter. Attempts to dismiss the find failed almost immediately. The bones were not distorted, not transitional in the way early hominins usually appear. They were modern in all the ways that matter, suggesting advanced cognition, social complexity, and adaptability. If these people existed 300 millennia ago, the question was no longer when we appeared, but how long we had already been here. The discovery did not stand alone for long. It was quickly joined by a pattern that could no longer be ignored. In the caves of Israel, remains of Homo sapiens dated to 120,000 years emerged, followed by footprints pressed into ancient mud at 90,000 years, and a human jaw at Mislia Cave dated to 180,000 years. These sites told a story of movement far earlier than any established model could comfortably explain. According to the old framework, modern humans should not have been present in the Levant until at least 60,000 years ago. Yet the bones were there, silent but unyielding, scattered across corridors that connect Africa to Eurasia. Then came Asia. In Fuyang Cave in southern China, researchers uncovered human teeth that were fully modern in shape and enamel structure. The dates attached to them reached back as far as 850,000 years. Teeth are among the most durable parts of the human body, and their morphology is not easily misread. These were not ambiguous fragments. They carried the unmistakable signature of modern humanity embedded deep in a past when no such presence was supposed to exist. Each new site tightened the pressure. Rather than a single wave of migration, the evidence suggested repeated dispersals, advances and retreats shaped by climate shifts, resource corridors, and ecological opportunity. Humans were not waiting patiently in one place for some cognitive switch to flip. They were already capable, already mobile, already experimenting with the world far earlier than expected. The map of early humanity began to resemble a web rather than an arrow. The tools found alongside these remains deepened the unease. At Jebel Irhoud, stone implements were not crude flakes struck at random. They were carefully shaped points produced through techniques that required foresight and precision. Many showed signs of hafting, a process where stone tips are attached to wooden shafts using adhesive compounds. This is not a simple act. It requires understanding that certain plant resins or birch tar will harden at specific temperatures, that timing matters, and that materials behave differently under heat and pressure. It is chemistry practiced without formulas, learned through repeated experimentation and transmitted across generations. Such tools imply coordinated hunting, planning beyond the immediate moment, and social structures capable of preserving technical knowledge. These are not traits of a species waiting to become human. They are the markers of minds already operating within a fully developed cognitive range. The uncomfortable implication followed naturally. If humans possessed modern brains and complex technologies 300,000 years ago, what were they doing for the next 200,000 years? Conventional archaeology points to a cultural explosion around 40 to 50,000 years ago, a sudden proliferation of art, symbolic objects, music, and advanced tools. This period has long been framed as the moment humanity truly awakened, but that framing depends on assuming nothing of significance came before, an assumption that now appears increasingly fragile. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially when time, erosion, and catastrophe are relentless erasers. Climate records reveal that the world humans inhabited during deep prehistory was anything but stable. Periods of warmth opened corridors across deserts and coastlines, while sudden cold snaps collapsed ecosystems and forced populations into refugees. Societies built in favorable windows may have vanished when those windows slammed shut. Organic materials decay, settlements erode, coastlines drown under rising seas. What survives is rarely representative of what once existed. Some researchers have begun to entertain a possibility once considered heretical, that early humans may have developed complex social structures and regional cultures multiple times, only to lose them to environmental upheaval. These would not have been cities of stone or empires etched into clay tablets, but organized networks capable of tool specialization, long-distance movement, and symbolic behavior. When conditions deteriorated, survival would favor mobility and simplicity, not monumentality. Evidence from Arabia supports this view. During periods when the region was lush and green, human populations spread deep into what is now desert. Lakebeds, stone tools, and habitation sites show people thriving in landscapes that today seem inhospitable. These were not timid foragers clinging to the margins. They were adaptable explorers responding dynamically to their environment, capable of rapid expansion when conditions allowed. As more sites are redated using modern techniques, a pattern continues to emerge. Human presence appears earlier, broader, and more persistent than any linear model can accommodate. Features once interpreted as evolutionary milestones now look more like recurring expressions of an already established capacity. Modernity does not arrive suddenly. It flickers in and out of visibility, shaped by preservation rather than potential. The old narrative required humans to be late bloomers, slowly accumulating intelligence until a final breakthrough. The emerging picture suggests something far more unsettling. We may have been ready for a very long time, constrained not by our minds, but by the volatility of the world we inherited. Our story is not one of steady ascent, but of repeated beginnings interrupted and resumed, each leaving only fragments behind. This realization forces a re-evaluation not only of when we appeared, but of what it means to be human. If our species was already cognitively complete hundreds of thousands of years ago, then civilization is not a destination we finally reached, but a state we have repeatedly approached, lost, and rediscovered. The ground beneath our origins is no longer solid. It is layered, fractured, and far deeper than we were ever told. For most of the 20th century, another assumption quietly reinforced the comfort of the linear story, that even if modern humans appeared late, they were at least alone in their sophistication. Other human species were reduced to supporting roles portrayed as evolutionary dead ends waiting to be replaced. None suffered this fate more than the Neanderthals. They were cast as thick-browed brutes, strong but dim, incapable of symbolism or long-term planning, a species destined to vanish the moment true intelligence arrived. That image did not survive contact with evidence. Long before genetics entered the conversation, archaeology had already begun undermining the caricature. In caves across Europe and Western Asia, Neanderthal sites revealed a level of organization that defied the idea of primitive survival. Living spaces were structured, not random. Hearths were placed deliberately to manage heat and smoke. Sleeping areas were separated from zones used for tool-making and food preparation, a spatial logic that mirrors how modern households naturally divide activity. This was not instinct alone. It reflected planning, memory, and shared social norms. Their tools told an even more precise story. The levallois technique, refined and widely used by Neanderthals, required the napper to imagine the final shape of a tool before striking the stone. It involved preparing a core in stages, removing flakes in a specific sequence so that the final strike would release a blade of predetermined form. This is reverse engineering in stone, an act that demands three-dimensional visualization and patience. It is closer to sculpting than to crude hammering. Chemical ingenuity pushed the boundary further. At sites in Germany, residues revealed that Neanderthals produced birch tar, a powerful adhesive created by heating birch bark in low oxygen conditions. This process requires controlled temperatures over extended periods. If the bark burns, the tar is destroyed. If it cools too quickly, nothing forms. Achieving this without metal containers or thermometers means understanding fire behavior intimately and anticipating invisible chemical changes. The resulting tar was used to haft tools, repair equipment, waterproof containers, and even for medicinal purposes due to its antibacterial properties. Art, once considered the exclusive domain of modern humans, also refused to stay confined. In Spanish caves, red ochre hand stencils and abstract markings were dated to 65,000 years ago, well before Homo sapiens arrived in Europe. These were not accidental smears, they were intentional placements, symbols applied to specific locations. Symbolism, by definition, reflects abstract thought, the ability to let one thing stand for another. It is a cognitive leap once believed impossible for Neanderthals. Burial practices added another layer. Neanderthal graves often contained grave goods, tools, animal bones, and pigments. Bodies were positioned deliberately, sometimes sprinkled with ochre, a red mineral associated across cultures with blood, life, and transition. Whether these acts reflected spiritual beliefs or complex social rituals, they demonstrate that Neanderthals did not treat death as a simple disposal problem. They recognized its meaning. Genetics delivered the final blow to the extinction narrative. When ancient DNA was first successfully extracted from Neanderthal bones, it revealed a truth that could not be negotiated away. Neanderthals and modern humans interbred, not once, but repeatedly. Today, anyone of non-African descent carries between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA. This is not a trivial remnant. These genes actively influence immune responses, skin pigmentation, metabolism, and even sleep patterns. They shape how our bodies respond to cold, pathogens, and stress. Interbreeding at this scale does not occur between species that barely tolerate one another. It implies prolonged coexistence, shared territories, and sustained social contact. Neanderthals were not wiped out in a single wave of competition. They were absorbed, their traits folded into the broader human gene pool. In a very real sense, they never vanished. They continue to live within us. Neanderthals were not alone. In 2008, a small fragment of fingerbone discovered in Denisova cave in Siberia carried DNA unlike any previously known human species. This group, now called Denisovans, emerged not through anatomy, but through genetics. Their physical remains are scarce, limited to fragments of bone and teeth, yet their genetic footprint is vast. Populations across Asia and Oceania carry Denisovan DNA, sometimes in surprisingly high proportions. In Tibet, Denisovan genes enable high-altitude adaptation, allowing people to process oxygen efficiently in thin air where others suffer severe altitude sickness. In parts of Papua New Guinea, Denisovan ancestry can make up as much as 5 to 6% of the genome. Such widespread genetic presence implies that Denisovans were not rare or isolated. They were numerous, adaptable, and geographically expansive. Even more unsettling is the diversity within Denisovan DNA itself. Different modern populations carry different Denisovan gene variants, indicating multiple episodes of interbreeding with distinct Denisovan groups. This suggests Denisovans were not a single, homogeneous population, but a collection of regional adaptations spread across vast ecological zones, from icy highlands to tropical forests. The scarcity of their fossils becomes a problem only if one assumes preservation is fair. Dense forests, acidic soils, and high rainfall destroy bone rapidly. Entire populations can vanish from the fossil record without leaving recognizable traces. Genetics, however, preserves memory with ruthless accuracy. Every inherited sequence is a timestamp, a record of contact that cannot be erased by erosion or flood. As genetic analysis advanced, something even stranger appeared. Researchers began detecting signals of human ancestry that did not match Neanderthals, Denisovans, or modern humans. These ghost populations are known only through genetic signatures. In Africa, some populations carry DNA from archaic humans who diverged from our lineage over 500,000 years ago, yet left no identified fossils. In Melanesia and Australia, another unknown lineage contributed significantly to the genome, persisting until surprisingly recent times. This means that for most of our evolutionary history, the planet was not inhabited by a single human species, but by many. They overlapped, met, exchanged genes, technologies, and behaviors. Evolution did not proceed as a ladder, but as a braided river, splitting and rejoining, reshaping itself through contact rather than isolation. The implication is difficult to escape. Homo sapiens did not emerge as a clean break from the past. We are a composite assembled through repeated encounters with other humans who were intelligent, capable, and deeply adapted to their worlds. Our success may not come from uniqueness, but from integration. We are not the endpoint of human evolution. We are its convergence. This reframes extinction itself. Instead of disappearance, many human lineages ended through absorption. Their bodies faded, but their solutions survived. Cold resistance, disease tolerance, altitude adaptation, and metabolic flexibility did not arise from a single genius species. They were inherited, blended, and refined across tens of thousands of years of shared existence. What we call humanity is not a singular identity forged in isolation. It is a collective inheritance built from many minds, many bodies, and many lost names. The more we uncover, the clearer it becomes that we were never alone, and that our story is not about replacing others, but becoming something new together. When genetics finally matured enough to read ancient DNA with precision, it did more than confirm archaeological suspicions. It rewrote the rules entirely. DNA is not a metaphorical record of the past. It is a literal archive, a molecular ledger that documents where ancestors lived, who they encountered, and which traits meant survival. Every mutation is a timestamp. Every inherited segment is proof of contact. When scientists began sequencing modern human genomes at scale, they expected regional variation layered over a mostly uniform core. What they found instead was a mosaic. Different sections of the human genome tell different stories. Some regions trace back to a common ancestor relatively recently. Others diverged more than 1 million years ago before rejoining through later interbreeding. And this means parts of you followed entirely separate evolutionary paths for hundreds of thousands of years before being reunited in a single body. Evolution, in this view, did not move forward as a single line, but as overlapping threads that repeatedly separated and reconnected. The first shock came from Africa itself. Long assumed to be genetically uniform compared to the rest of the world, African populations revealed something unexpected. Certain West and Central African groups carry genetic segments that split from the Homo sapiens lineage more than 500,000 years ago. These segments do not match Neanderthals or Denisovans. They belong to unknown archaic humans who lived, adapted, and later interbred with the ancestors of modern Africans. No fossils have yet been linked to these populations, but their genetic signatures are undeniable. This matters because it collapses the idea of a clean African origin. Africa was not a single breeding ground producing a finished species. It was a complex ecosystem of human groups interacting over immense spans of time. Modern Africans are not genetically closer to some hypothetical original Homo sapiens. They are, like everyone else, the product of admixture. The difference is that much of Africa's deep genetic history remains invisible in bone but alive in blood. Outside Africa, the picture grows even more intricate. Genomes from Europe and Asia show multiple layers of Neanderthal ancestry, not one. These layers correspond to different periods and regions, indicating repeated episodes of contact. The earliest wave likely occurred around 100,000 years ago in the Middle East, when early modern humans moving out of Africa encountered established Neanderthal populations. Later waves followed as humans spread deeper into Eurasia. Denisovan ancestry complicates things further. Unlike Neanderthal DNA, which is relatively consistent across non-African populations, Denisovan DNA appears in distinct regional forms. Southeast Asian populations carry different Denisovan genes than those found in Tibet or Melanesia. This implies not one Denisovan population, but several, each adapted to local environments and each contributing unique traits to modern humans. In Tibet, a Denisovan-derived gene affects hemoglobin regulation, allowing people to thrive at high altitude without thickened blood that strains the heart. This adaptation did not evolve independently in modern humans. It was acquired. In Melanesia, Denisovan genes influence immune responses and fat metabolism, likely conferring advantages in tropical environments dense with pathogens. These are not passive remnants, they are active solutions inherited from other humans who had already solved these problems. As researchers pushed deeper into genomic analysis, they identified signals of at least 2 additional archaic populations outside Africa. These ghost lineages left no recognized fossils but contributed significant genetic material to modern populations. One such lineage appears in the genomes of Aboriginal Australians and Papuans, diverging from other humans roughly 400,000 years ago and persisting until surprisingly late. Another appears sporadically across Southeast Asia, hinting at regional humans we have yet to name. The existence of ghost populations exposes a limitation of fossil-based narratives. Fossils are rare accidents. DNA is pervasive. A population can vanish entirely from the physical record yet remain present in millions of living bodies. Genetics does not care whether bones fossilize. It preserves contact, not monuments. This genetic complexity explains long-standing puzzles in anthropology. Similar technologies appearing thousands of miles apart no longer require independent invention or coincidence. Gene flow implies cultural flow. When populations met and interbred, they also exchanged ideas, techniques, and behaviors. Innovation did not spread only through migration. It spread through contact. It also explains why human diversity is so resilient. Rather than specializing narrowly for one environment, humanity accumulated adaptations from many: cold tolerance from Neanderthals, altitude efficiency from Denisovans, disease resistance from African ghost populations, metabolic flexibility from unknown tropical lineages. What we call modern humanity is a composite toolkit assembled across continents and epochs. This reframes natural selection itself. Instead of waiting for random mutations to arise within a single population, humans gained access to pre-tested adaptations through hybridization. When conditions changed rapidly, as they often did during the Pleistocene, this flexibility meant survival. Populations that could absorb useful traits from neighbors had an advantage over those that remained isolated. Even traits once considered uniquely human may have deeper roots. Cognitive capacity, symbolic thought, and social complexity likely did not originate in a single group at a single moment. They may have emerged gradually across multiple populations, refined through interaction rather than isolated genius. Intelligence itself may be a shared inheritance. The idea of distinct human species begins to lose coherence under this lens. Traditional taxonomy relies on clear boundaries, but evolution rarely respects them. Genetic evidence suggests that many human species were not fully isolated. They formed what some researchers now describe as a human superpopulation, a network of groups distinct enough to adapt locally yet connected enough to exchange genes over time. In such a system, extinction is not always disappearance. Sometimes it is dilution. A population may lose its distinct physical form while contributing its most effective traits to future generations. From this perspective, Neanderthals and Denisovans did not fail. They succeeded so well that parts of them became universal. This challenges deeply held assumptions about superiority and progress. Modern humans did not triumph because they were smarter, stronger, or more advanced in isolation. They endured because they were permeable. They absorbed rather than erased. Their boundaries were flexible where others were rigid. The genome becomes a record not of conquest but of cooperation under pressure. It tells a story where survival favored connection over purity. Every modern human body carries evidence of this truth, layered invisibly beneath the skin. As this picture sharpens, the question shifts again. If humanity has always been a blended network rather than a single lineage, then the emergence of civilization cannot be understood as the achievement of one group alone. It must be seen as the expression of accumulated knowledge carried through many hands and many minds, some of which no longer exist as separate peoples. The past is not behind us, it is inside us, encoded, functional, and still shaping how we breathe, think, and endure. To understand where civilization comes from, we must first accept that humanity itself was never singular, never simple, and never finished becoming. If humanity was already ancient, mobile, and cognitively complete long before the traditional dawn of civilization, then the next assumption to fall is the idea that complex society emerged only once, recently, and from nothing. The archaeological record has long suggested a sharp break around 10 to 12,000 years ago when agriculture, permanent settlements, and monumental construction appeared almost simultaneously in multiple regions. This has been framed as a revolution, a sudden leap forward driven by necessity or ingenuity. Yet revolutions rarely occur in isolation, and they rarely emerge without precedent. In southeastern Turkey, a low, unremarkable hill concealed a contradiction too large to ignore. When excavations at Göbekli Tepe began in the mid-1990s, what emerged was not the tentative architecture of early farmers, but fully realized monumental stonework. Massive T-shaped pillars, some weighing more than 15 tons, were arranged in precise circular enclosures. They were carved with reliefs of animals rendered in confident naturalistic detail, foxes mid-stride, snakes coiling along stone edges, birds frozen in motion. These carvings were not decorative afterthoughts. They were integrated into the structure itself. Radiocarbon dating placed the earliest phases of Göbekli Tepe at roughly 11,600 years ago. At that time, according to conventional models, humans in the region were still small bands of hunter-gatherers without permanent homes, metallurgy, or organized labor. The scale of the site alone contradicts that image. Quarrying, transporting, carving, and erecting stones of this size required planning, coordination, and leadership over extended periods. Estimates suggest that hundreds of workers would have been needed, sustained over decades. What makes this more unsettling is what Göbekli Tepe lacks. There is no evidence of domestic housing, no clear signs of agriculture, no storage facilities typical of farming societies. The people who built this were not settled farmers constructing temples as a byproduct of surplus. The monument appears first before the infrastructure traditionally believed necessary to support it. This reverses the expected order of development. The artistic sophistication deepens the problem. The reliefs show consistent stylistic conventions across multiple enclosures, implying a shared symbolic system passed down through generations. Abstract symbols appear alongside animals, repeated with enough regularity to suggest meaning rather than decoration. Some scholars interpret these motifs as cosmological markers, others as clan symbols or mythic narratives. Regardless of interpretation, the act of encoding meaning into stone presupposes a cultural memory capable of maintaining shared understanding over time. Göbekli Tepe does not stand alone. Across the surrounding region, now known as the Fertile Crescent, similar sites have emerged. Karahan Tepe, Nivali Chori, and other locations reveal comparable stone pillars, complex layouts, and artistic motifs. Some include subterranean chambers carved directly into bedrock, connected by passageways that suggest controlled movement and ritual use. The precision of the stonework challenges the assumption that only metal tools could achieve such results. Equally troubling is what happened next. Göbekli Tepe was not abandoned, it was deliberately buried. Each enclosure was carefully filled with tons of rubble, stone fragments, and soil. This was not the result of collapse or natural sedimentation. It was intentional, systematic, and repeated over centuries. The effort required to bury the site rivaled the effort required to build it. Why would a society expend immense energy to erase its own greatest achievement? The burial appears to have been planned, not rushed. Stratigraphic layers show phases of infilling, suggesting ongoing maintenance of concealment. This behavior does not align with invasion or disaster alone. It suggests choice. One explanation is ritual closure, the idea that sacred spaces were decommissioned as belief systems changed. Another proposes environmental shifts that made the site unusable. Yet neither fully explains the scale or care of the burial. A more unsettling possibility emerges when viewed alongside broader climatic data. Around the same period, the planet experienced dramatic climate instability. The Younger Dryas marked a sudden return to near-glacial conditions after a warming trend. Temperatures dropped sharply within a few years. Rainfall patterns shifted. Regions that had supported abundant game and seasonal plant growth became unpredictable. For societies dependent on complex networks of cooperation, such instability would have been catastrophic. If communities anticipated long-term disruption, burying monumental sites could have served as preservation rather than destruction. Stone protects what soil conceals. By sealing these structures, their builders may have intended to safeguard them against erosion, vandalism, or misuse, trusting that future generations might one day uncover and understand them. This interpretation gains weight when considering continuity. Some sites show evidence of visitation long after burial, as if later groups returned to ensure concealment remained intact. Knowledge did not vanish overnight. It receded, condensed, and adapted to new conditions. If this pattern holds, the emergence of agriculture itself may need re-evaluation. Instead of agriculture enabling civilization, civilization may have driven agriculture as a survival response. Large, organized populations facing environmental instability would need reliable food sources. Cultivation becomes not a spark, but a fallback. Across the world, agriculture appears almost simultaneously in regions as distant as the Levant, China, Mesoamerica, and the Andes. This has often been explained as parallel invention. Yet the improbability of identical solutions arising independently within such a narrow window invites reconsideration. Shared memory, carried through migratory survivors, could explain the convergence. Archaeological layers from this period often show abrupt simplification. Complex tools disappear, replaced by cruder forms. Artistic traditions vanish, settlements shrink. This looks less like progress and more like recovery. Survivors rebuild using fragments of what they remember, constrained by diminished resources and fractured networks. Monumental architecture after this period reappears slowly. Stone circles, pyramids, and megalithic structures emerge thousands of years later, often aligned with astronomical events and built with techniques that seem to echo older knowledge. The gap between loss and rediscovery suggests that something significant was forgotten, not invented from scratch. Civilization in this light is not a straight ascent from ignorance to mastery. It is a cycle of accumulation and erasure shaped by forces larger than any society. The ruins we uncover may not mark beginnings but interruptions. Göbekli Tepe stands as a reminder that complexity does not require permanence to exist. It can flourish briefly, leave few traces, and vanish under pressure. What survives may be only the echo mistaken for origin when it is in fact a return. If humanity has repeatedly approached complexity and lost it, then the question shifts again. What else has been buried, intentionally or otherwise, beneath layers of time and assumption? And how many of our firsts are simply the last ones we remember? If monumental sites like Göbekli Tepe hint at lost cycles of complexity, the natural question becomes what could have forced such societies to retreat, fragment, or disappear altogether? The answer does not lie in myth or speculation alone, but in the physical record of the planet itself. Earth carries scars layered into ice, sediment, and stone that testify to episodes of sudden violence capable of unraveling even the most adaptive human networks. Around 12,900 years ago, the climate did something it was not supposed to do. After thousands of years of gradual warming at the end of the last ice age, temperatures in the northern hemisphere plunged abruptly. This event, known as the Younger Dryas, reversed warming trends in a matter of years, not centuries. Greenland ice cores, which function like frozen timelines by trapping ancient air bubbles year by year, show temperature drops of up to 15 degrees Celsius within a single human lifetime. This was not a localized anomaly. Evidence from Europe, North America, and Asia reveals synchronous disruption. Glaciers advanced, forests retreated, rainfall patterns collapsed. Regions that had supported dense human populations became marginal almost overnight. For societies reliant on predictable seasonal cycles, this sudden instability would have shattered food systems and mobility routes. Geological data adds another layer of disturbance. Sediment cores from lakes and oceans dating to the onset of the Younger Dryas contain spikes of charcoal, indicating widespread wildfires. These were not isolated burns, but continent-scale fire events. Forests ignited simultaneously across vast distances, producing smoke plumes large enough to alter atmospheric circulation and further suppress temperatures. Even more unsettling are microscopic markers found in these same layers. Scientists have identified nanodiamonds, magnetic spherules, and melt glass particles, materials that form only under extreme heat and pressure. These are signatures commonly associated with cosmic impacts. They appear abruptly at the Younger Dryas boundary, distributed across multiple continents, suggesting a global event rather than regional volcanism or tectonic activity. This evidence gave rise to the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, which proposes that fragments of a large comet or asteroid struck or exploded above Earth's surface, triggering fires, destabilizing ice sheets, and injecting debris into the atmosphere. Such an event would not require a single massive crater. Airbursts, like the Tunguska explosion in 1908, demonstrate how cosmic objects can release enormous energy without leaving obvious impact scars. Skepticism initially met this hypothesis, as extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence. Over time, however, the growing consistency of impact markers across independent sites strengthened the case. No conventional climate mechanism alone explains the speed, scale, and simultaneity of the changes observed. The biological consequences were immediate and severe. The Younger Dryas coincides with the extinction of much of the world's megafauna. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, and massive bears vanished within a narrow time frame. Their disappearance was not gradual. Many fossil sites show evidence of sudden death, with broken bones and mixed remains suggesting floods, shockwaves, or rapid environmental collapse. Human populations were not spared. Archaeological records show abrupt breaks in habitation layers. Long-established sites were abandoned. Tool traditions disappeared or simplified. Population density dropped sharply in multiple regions. Genetic studies support this, revealing bottlenecks where human diversity contracted, implying dramatic population loss. In North America, the Clovis culture, known for its distinctive fluted spear points, vanished almost exactly at the onset of the Younger Dryas. For years, overhunting was blamed, yet Clovis technology disappears too quickly and too completely to fit a slow ecological explanation. Catastrophe fits better. If complex societies existed before this period, even in proto-forms, their vulnerability would have been extreme. Large populations depend on coordination, surplus, and stability. Remove those conditions abruptly and collapse follows. Survivors would be forced into small, mobile groups, prioritizing immediate survival over preservation of complex knowledge. Memory, however, does not vanish entirely. Certain skills endure because they are useful under pressure. Stoneworking persists. Fire control remains essential. Navigation by stars survives because it aids movement when landscapes change. Other knowledge, especially abstract or large-scale systems, fades when there are no institutions to maintain it. This selective survival of knowledge may explain a persistent pattern. After the Younger Dryas, humanity re-emerges with familiar but reduced capabilities. Agriculture appears, but initially crude. Architecture returns, but modest. Astronomical awareness persists, yet encoded in myth rather than measurement. It is not a new beginning, but a reconstruction from fragments. Similar patterns appear earlier in time. The Toba supereruption around 74,000 years ago blanketed much of the world in ash and triggered a volcanic winter. Genetic evidence suggests human populations dropped to a few thousand breeding individuals. Yet humanity survived, carrying forward adaptations and behaviors that reappeared later. Around 40,000 years ago, another disruption coincides with sudden cultural shifts in Europe. including the disappearance of Neanderthals and the rapid spread of new artistic traditions. Environmental stress, not superiority alone, may have driven these transitions. Seen across deep time, catastrophe is not the exception. It is the recurring context. Civilization does not rise in a vacuum. It rises between disasters, shaped by what remains after each reset. This perspective reframes human history as resilient but fragile, innovative yet repeatedly constrained by planetary forces beyond control. It suggests that complexity has emerged multiple times, only to be compressed by events that favor adaptability over accumulation. The stone circles buried under hills, the sudden silences in cultural layers, and the genetic bottlenecks etched into our DNA all point to the same conclusion. Humanity has not simply advanced, it has endured. What we inherit today may be less a triumph of linear progress than the residue of countless recoveries. The past did not fail us, it was interrupted, and the forces capable of doing so are written not in legend, but in the geology beneath our feet. If catastrophic resets repeatedly fractured human progress, then the persistence of advanced knowledge across deep time becomes the next anomaly demanding explanation. Certain forms of information should not survive repeated collapses, yet they appear again and again in cultures separated by oceans and millennia. Among the most difficult to dismiss is precise astronomical and geographical knowledge that requires long-term observation, mathematical abstraction, and stable transmission across generations. Long before telescopes or modern instruments, ancient cultures tracked the sky with a precision that strains conventional explanations. In Egypt, the alignment of the Great Pyramid of Giza remains one of the most accurate feats of orientation ever achieved. Its sides deviate from true north by less than a fraction of a degree, a level of precision that rivals modern surveying methods. Achieving this without magnetic compasses or advanced optics implies systematic stellar observation and an understanding of Earth's rotation. Inside the pyramid, narrow shafts point toward specific stars that occupied critical positions in the sky at the time of construction. Due to the slow wobble of Earth's axis known as precession, the position of stars relative to Earth changes over a cycle of roughly 26,000 years. Accounting for this requires not just observation, but prediction, an ability to model how the sky shifts over centuries. The builders did not merely record the heavens, they anticipated them. This awareness of precession appears elsewhere. Ancient texts describe long celestial cycles that exceed the lifespan of any single observer. The concept itself is abstract, invisible in daily experience. It can only be inferred by comparing records across many generations. Such continuity presupposes institutions dedicated to preserving knowledge through time, resilient enough to outlast social upheaval. In Mesopotamia, cuneiform tablets reveal astronomical calculations of astonishing accuracy. Babylonian astronomers predicted lunar eclipses decades in advance using numerical cycles refined through centuries of observation. Their estimate of the solar year deviates from modern measurements by mere minutes. These were not approximations born of chance. They were the products of rigorous data collection and mathematical reasoning. In South Asia, ancient astronomical texts describe planetary motions and Earth's dimensions with striking precision. Estimates of Earth's circumference approach modern values closely enough to imply large-scale measurement or inherited knowledge from earlier surveying traditions. These texts also describe celestial phenomena that cannot be observed with the naked eye alone, raising questions about how such details entered the record. Across the Atlantic, the Maya developed a calendar system more accurate than the one used globally today. Their calculation of the solar year differs from modern values by less than 2 minutes. They tracked the cycles of Venus with extraordinary precision, predicting its appearances and disappearances across centuries. Their observatories were not symbolic monuments but functional instruments built into architecture, aligned to capture specific celestial events. What makes this convergence difficult to dismiss is not simply accuracy, but consistency. Different civilizations with no verified contact recorded the same cycles, the same periods, and the same cosmic rhythms. Precession, eclipse cycles, planetary synodic periods, and solar years appear repeatedly, embedded in myth, ritual, and architecture. Geographical knowledge presents a similar puzzle. Medieval and Renaissance maps, long dismissed as crude or symbolic, reveal details that should not have been known at the time of their creation. The Piri Reis map, compiled in the early 16th century, depicts the coastlines of South America with an accuracy unmatched by European explorers of that era. Even more controversial is its apparent representation of Antarctica, without ice, matching subglacial topography, mapped only in the 20th century. The map's creator explicitly stated that his sources were far older, inherited from previous cultures. Similar anomalies appear in other maps, such as those by Orontius Phineas and Haji Ahmed, which depict continental features and proportions inconsistent with the geographical knowledge available at the time. These maps are not uniformly accurate, but their accurate sections are accurate in ways that cannot be explained by guesswork. One explanation is coincidence or retroactive interpretation. Yet the repeated appearance of precise features across independent documents weakens that argument. Another explanation is inheritance, the survival of fragments from earlier surveying traditions that once possessed a global perspective lost in later eras. Such surveying would require advanced navigation, long-distance travel, and mathematical frameworks capable of translating curved Earth geometry into flat representations. This level of sophistication does not align neatly with the technological profiles assigned to ancient societies based solely on surviving artifacts. If knowledge survived collapse, it likely did so in compressed forms. Myths, symbols, and ritual practices can encode information abstractly, preserving patterns without explicit explanation. A story about gods moving stars may preserve awareness of celestial cycles. A ritual tied to seasonal change may encode astronomical timing. Over time, meaning shifts, but structure remains. This mechanism explains why advanced knowledge often appears embedded in religious or mythological contexts. When formal institutions collapse, symbolic transmission becomes the most resilient vehicle. Oral tradition, ritual repetition, and sacred architecture can preserve information far longer than written records in unstable environments. Stone, too, becomes a medium of memory. Alignments endure when languages vanish. A temple oriented to a solstice continues to mark time long after its builders are forgotten. Knowledge survives not because it is understood, but because it is embedded in form. If this pattern holds, then ancient civilizations may have been inheritors rather than originators. They rediscovered, reinterpreted, and refined knowledge that predated them, adapting it to new cultural frameworks. What appears as sudden genius may be revival. This perspective does not require a single lost global civilization. It allows for networks of knowledge transmission across deep time, carried by migrating survivors, encoded in ritual, and reassembled when conditions allowed. Each collapse thinned the archive, each recovery rebuilt from what remained. The persistence of astronomical and geographical precision across cultures suggests continuity rather than coincidence. It implies that humanity has long observed the world with disciplined attention, even when its material culture regressed. Knowledge, unlike stone, does not need permanence to endure. It needs memory, pattern, and repetition. In a species shaped by catastrophe, the most valuable information would be that which could be hidden in plain sight, disguised as story, embedded in stone, and passed on without explanation. What survives disaster is not always what was most advanced, but what was most adaptable. The sky does not change its cycles when civilizations fall. Those who remember how to read it carry forward a map through time itself. When advanced knowledge survives collapse, it rarely does so in clear language. It hides inside form, repetition, and habit. Techniques remain after their explanations vanish, rituals persist after their logic dissolves, and symbols endure long after the minds that created them are gone. This transformation creates the illusion of independent invention, when in reality what is occurring is inheritance under pressure. Few domains reveal this more clearly than stone architecture, repeated across continents with structural similarities too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. Megalithic construction is often framed as a primitive obsession with size, an expression of ritual or social bonding rather than engineering intelligence. That interpretation collapses when the structures are examined closely. These monuments are not crude, they are systems. Their builders understood load distribution, stress relief, vibration, and long-term durability. Stone was not chosen for spectacle alone. It was chosen because it remembers. In the highlands of Peru, the walls of Sacsayhuaman rise from the landscape like fractured bedrock, composed of enormous polygonal stones fitted so precisely that modern tools struggle to improve upon them. Each block interlocks with its neighbors at irregular angles, creating joints that disperse seismic energy. When earthquakes strike, later colonial structures crumble while these walls remain intact. No mortar binds them. Geometry does the work. This is not trial and error. It is applied understanding of stone behavior. Egypt presents a parallel. Near the Great Sphinx, blocks weighing over 200 tons were quarried, transported, and positioned with tolerances measured in millimeters. Such precision demands not only manpower but logistics, planning, and standardized methods. Leverage systems, sled transport, surface preparation, and coordination across large labor forces must all function together. Yet no gradual developmental sequence leads up to these techniques. They appear fully formed in the archaeological record. On the island of Malta, massive stone temples predate both Stonehenge and the Egyptian pyramids. Their walls curve inward, forming chambers with specific acoustic properties. Low-frequency sound resonates strongly within these spaces, producing measurable effects on the human nervous system. These are not accidental byproducts. The builders shaped stone with intention toward human perception, suggesting experimentation carried out over time and preserved through replication. Across the globe, alignment recurs as a defining feature. Structures are oriented to solstices, equinoxes, lunar standstills, and stellar risings. Achieving this requires long-term observation and accurate record-keeping. A single generation cannot confirm most of these cycles. Knowledge had to be inherited and trusted. Error would compound quickly if understanding were shallow. Stonehenge illustrates this principle clearly. Beyond its alignment to the summer solstice sunrise, it encodes lunar cycles that repeat every 18.5 years. Tracking such a cycle requires observation across decades. The builders could not rely on personal experience alone. They relied on accumulated memory. The structure itself became the record. In Egypt, temples and pyramids mirror celestial patterns tied to Orion and other prominent star groupings. While interpretations vary, the architectural commitment to sky-ground correspondence is unmistakable. The sky becomes a reference frame, stable even when societies fracture. In Mesoamerica, pyramids interact with light and shadow during equinoxes, transforming architecture into a moving calendar. Stone captures time when writing fails. What unites these structures is not shared religion or shared language, but shared priorities: durability, orientation, memory. Stone survives fire, flood, and neglect. Alignments survive regime change. When knowledge is at risk, embedding it into the landscape becomes a strategy. This suggests a reversal of common assumptions. Monumental architecture may not represent the confident beginning of civilization, but a defensive response to instability. When societies anticipate disruption, they encode what matters most into what lasts longest. A structure aligned to the stars preserves timekeeping even if calendars disappear. A wall engineered for earthquakes preserves space even if tools regress. Such monuments function as mnemonic devices at a civilizational scale. They transmit information without words. Proportion, orientation, repetition, and placement carry meaning across generations that may no longer understand its origin. After collapse, survivors inherit form without function. Ritual replaces explanation or replaces comprehension. This process explains why later cultures frequently reuse older structures. In Egypt, dynasties restored monuments whose construction techniques they could no longer replicate. In the Andes, the Inca built atop older foundations they openly admired and could not reproduce. In Europe, churches rose on ancient stone circles, absorbing significance they did not create. Each act preserved continuity while erasing authorship. Through repetition, meaning shifted. Engineering became sacred geometry. Observation became myth. Instruction became tradition. The original knowledge survived, but only in compressed form. Stone endured. Explanation did not. The global recurrence of megalithic principles does not require a single lost empire or advanced global civilization. It requires something simpler and more human, repeated loss followed by selective memory. Small groups survive catastrophe. They carry fragments of understanding. When stability returns, they rebuild using what they remember worked. Food systems may change, languages vanish, social hierarchies reset. But stone, sky, and time remain. Aligning structures to celestial cycles requires no writing, only patience and trust in inherited knowledge. Once learned, it can be repeated indefinitely. This perspective reframes ancient monuments. They are not anomalies waiting to be explained away. They are signals. They indicate that humans learned early what endures and what does not. Wood burns, clay erodes, metal is scavenged, stone persists. A civilization that has watched itself erased would understand this instinctively. It would build not for glory, but for survival of memory. It would expect interruption and plan accordingly. The monuments that remain today may not be celebrations of triumph. They may be warnings cast into matter. They speak of continuity under threat, of knowledge preserved without explanation, of societies that expected to be forgotten. Stone does not narrate history, it preserves conditions. Those who learn to read it are not uncovering origins. They are encountering messages left behind for those who would have to begin again. As stone preserved memory in form, another medium carried it invisibly through catastrophe, the human body itself. While monuments endured externally, biology archived experience internally. Genes do not record stories, but they encode solutions, refined under pressure, and passed forward when everything else failed. When examined closely, human physiology reveals adaptations that make little sense if civilization is young and linear, but become coherent if survival has repeatedly depended on recovery after collapse. One of the most striking examples lies in the human stress response. Modern humans are uniquely capable of functioning under prolonged uncertainty. Cortisol regulation, emotional suppression under threat, and rapid cognitive switching between planning and improvisation are not accidental traits. They reflect selection under unstable conditions, where survival favored flexibility over specialization. This is not the profile of a species that evolved only in steady environments. It is the profile of one shaped by disruption. Sleep patterns tell a similar story. Humans exhibit segmented sleep tendencies under natural conditions, a pattern where rest occurs in phases rather than uninterrupted blocks. This pattern allows vigilance during the night, a useful trait in environments where danger is unpredictable. Genetic studies link this tendency in part to Neanderthal inheritance, suggesting it was refined during long periods of coexistence with other humans under harsh climates. It is not optimized for modern productivity, it is optimized for endurance. Immune diversity provides even clearer evidence. The human immune system is unusually variable, especially in populations with deep admixture histories. Genes inherited from Neanderthals and Denisovans enhance resistance to pathogens encountered in Eurasian and tropical environments. These genes did not evolve within modern humans alone. They were acquired. Each represents an answer to a threat encountered long before recorded history. Such traits persist because they remain useful. Collapse does not eliminate disease, cold, hunger, or fear. It amplifies them. A population that carries a wide range of defensive adaptations is more likely to survive when infrastructure fails. Biology becomes the final archive when culture is stripped away. This internal preservation extends beyond physiology into cognition. Humans are unusually good at pattern recognition, even when none exists. While this tendency can produce superstition, it also enables rapid learning in novel environments. Seeing connections quickly, even incorrectly, is preferable to missing a real threat. This cognitive bias favors survival during upheaval when familiar rules no longer apply. Memory itself appears tuned for compression. Humans forget details but retain structure. We remember rhythms, sequences, and spatial layouts more readily than precise data. This is why oral traditions survive where written records vanish. Stories preserve relationships, not measurements. When stability returns, structure can be rebuilt from those relationships. Language reflects this bias. Core grammatical frameworks change slowly while vocabulary shifts rapidly. This allows communication to persist even when cultures fragment. A shared structure enables new meaning to be layered onto old forms. Language survives collapse by being flexible rather than precise. Even social behavior bears the imprint of repeated resets. Humans form hierarchies quickly, but dismantle them under stress. Cooperation expands during crisis and contracts during abundance. This oscillation mirrors cycles of collapse and recovery. Societies do not simply progress toward complexity. They pulse. Genetic bottlenecks visible in human DNA align with known catastrophic events. These bottlenecks represent moments when populations shrank dramatically, forcing rapid adaptation. Traits that supported survival during those moments became entrenched. Traits useful only in stable abundance did not. This explains a paradox. Humans are capable of extraordinary complexity, yet repeatedly return to simpler modes of living. This is not regression, it is resilience. Complexity is expensive. Simplicity survives when resources vanish. The ability to move between these modes is itself an adaptation. The brain reflects this duality. It supports abstract reasoning, art, and long-term planning, yet can suppress these functions under threat in favor of immediate action. This flexibility allows survival during chaos without permanently losing higher capacity. When conditions stabilize, complexity re-emerges. This oscillation undermines the idea that civilization is a one-way ascent. Instead, it behaves like a wave, rising when conditions allow, breaking when they do not, and reforming from what remains. Biology ensures that each wave begins with inherited solutions rather than ignorance. Viewed this way, the so-called primitive phases of human history are not failures, they are fallback states. They represent the minimum viable configuration of humanity under constraint. When food is scarce and danger constant, art shrinks, architecture simplifies, and technology compresses. But the potential for expansion remains intact. This is why complexity can appear suddenly in the archaeological record. It was not invented from nothing, it was released from constraint. When climate stabilizes, resources increase, and population density rises, latent capacity expresses itself rapidly. What looks like a revolution is often a rebound. The human body remembers what the environment forgets. It carries forward adaptations earned through countless trials. Each generation inherits not only DNA, but the accumulated results of survival under extremes. This inheritance makes humanity difficult to erase completely. If advanced societies existed before recorded history, their destruction would not erase humanity's capacity to rebuild. The knowledge encoded in genes, behaviors, and instincts would remain, waiting for favorable conditions. Civilization would not restart at zero. It would restart at baseline. This perspective reframes the question of lost civilizations. The issue is not whether humanity forgot everything, but what could realistically survive. Writing, metallurgy, and large-scale organization are fragile. Adaptability, cooperation, and pattern recognition are not. What endures after catastrophe is not achievement, but capability. Humanity's greatest inheritance may not be monuments or myths, but the quiet resilience embedded in its biology. The body is older than any city. It has survived ice ages, impacts, famine, and fire. Long after stone erodes and stories distort, it continues to carry forward the lessons of survival, encoded not as memory, but as function. In this sense, humanity itself is the longest-lasting artifact of its own history, shaped not by uninterrupted progress, but by repeated endings and deliberate continuations. As biology preserved the capacity to rebuild, memory preserved fragments of meaning carried not through genes but through story. Myth is often dismissed as fantasy, yet its persistence across cultures and epochs suggests a different function. Myths survive where records fail because they compress experience into narrative form, encoding environmental memory, social warning, and astronomical awareness beneath symbolism. When civilizations fracture, myth becomes the last vessel capable of crossing the gap intact. Across the world, ancient stories repeat the same core events with unsettling consistency. A great flood destroys the world, fire falls from the sky, the sun behaves strangely, darkness lingers where light should be. Survivors retreat to high ground, caves or boats. Knowledge is lost. Humanity begins again. These motifs appear in Mesopotamia, India, the Americas, Africa, and Oceania. They are often treated as metaphor or moral allegory, yet the recurrence of specific sequences suggests lived experience rather than creative invention. Flood myths are among the most widespread. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes a sudden deluge that erases cities and reshapes the land. Similar accounts appear in Hindu traditions, indigenous American narratives, and ancient Chinese chronicles. These are not gentle river floods, they are abrupt, overwhelming, and described with terror rather than reverence. Such stories align closely with post-Ice Age sea level rise, when melting glaciers flooded vast coastal plains that had supported human populations for thousands of years. Archaeology confirms that many regions now submerged were once dry and densely inhabited. Coastlines extended far beyond their present boundaries. When ice sheets destabilized, sea levels rose in rapid pulses, not slow increments. Entire landscapes vanished within generations. Survivors would not preserve measurements or dates. They would preserve fear, loss, and warning. Story carries those elements far more effectively than data. Fire from the sky myths follow a similar pattern. Cultures describe blazing objects, roaring winds, deafening noise, and forests igniting across vast distances. In North America, indigenous oral traditions speak of a time when the sky fell and the land burned. In the Near East, stories of divine fire destroying cities echo through texts later canonized as religious scripture. These accounts align with geological evidence of widespread wildfires and impact markers dating to the onset of the Younger Dryas. The language of myth obscures mechanism but preserves sequence: sudden light, explosive sound, heat, fire, darkness, cold, hunger, survival, renewal. These stages mirror what would follow a large cosmic airburst or fragmented impact. Myth becomes the safest container for trauma, too vast to explain directly. Astronomical myths encode longer cycles. Many ancient cultures describe worlds or ages governed by the sky, each ending in catastrophe before renewal. Time resets. Civilizations rise and fall. These cycles often correspond numerically to known astronomical periods such as precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that alters climate patterns over tens of thousands of years. Awareness of such cycles cannot be gained within a single lifetime. It requires inherited observation. In Mesoamerican tradition, previous worlds are destroyed by flood, fire, and darkness. The Maya calendar does not predict an end of time, but tracks cycles of renewal. The emphasis is not apocalypse, but repetition. Something ends, something returns. Knowledge survives only if deliberately carried forward. Myth also preserves geography. Stories of sunken lands, drowned ancestors, and lost islands appear globally. Plato's account of Atlantis describes a capable society destroyed by sudden catastrophe and swallowed by the sea. Whether literal or symbolic, it mirrors the fate of real coastal cultures erased by post-glacial flooding. The form may be embellished, but the core experience is consistent. Crucially, myths do not depend on centralized authority. They persist through oral transmission passed from elders to children without reliance on writing, infrastructure, or political continuity. This makes them resilient under collapse. Language shifts, names change, structure remains, meaning survives even as details blur. Symbols function as compression tools. Serpents represent water or cyclical time. Firebringers symbolize sudden destruction or transformative knowledge. Sky gods who rage or fall encode observations of celestial events. These symbols recur because they work. They are memorable, adaptable, and emotionally charged. When later societies encountered ancient monuments whose original purposes were no longer understood, myth filled the gap. Structures became the work of gods or giants. Precision became magic. This was not ignorance, but reinterpretation under constraint. Myth preserved reverence where understanding was lost, protecting what might otherwise have been destroyed. This explains why myth and monument often coexist. Stone preserves alignment and proportion. Story preserves meaning and warning. Together they form a distributed archive. When one fails, the other carries forward enough to allow rediscovery. Modern dismissal of myth as false history reflects a bias toward written records and measurement. Yet writing is fragile, libraries burn, archives decay, digital storage corrupts. Oral tradition survives because it lives inside people. It trades precision for endurance. If humanity endured repeated resets, myth would naturally accumulate layers. Each catastrophe adds another version. Each recovery reframes the past. Over time, myth becomes a palimpsest, recording not one event, but many. The challenge is not deciding whether myths are true, but learning how to read them. When myths across continents align in structure, sequence, and theme, coincidence becomes an inadequate explanation. Shared experience becomes simpler. Humanity remembers what nearly erased it. This reframes ancient stories not as superstition, but as compressed memory. They are not literal reports, but neither are they fiction. They are survival narratives shaped to endure disruption. In a world where collapse is recurrent rather than hypothetical, the most valuable knowledge is not how to build, but how to remember. Myth does not explain the past. It ensures it is not forgotten. What survives catastrophe is not accuracy, but meaning. Myths preserve meaning. They warn, instruct, and prepare. They whisper that the world has ended before and will end again. Those who listen carefully do not hear fear alone. They hear instruction. Build where water will not rise. Watch the sky. Expect change, and understand that starting over is not failure, but continuation. When myth, monument, and biology are viewed together, a pattern emerges that challenges the modern fixation on beginnings. Civilization does not appear as a single breakthrough, but as a recurring condition, one that surfaces when constraints loosen and retreats when the environment tightens its grip. What is commonly labeled progress may simply be the visible phase of a cycle that has repeated far longer than memory allows. This perspective helps explain one of the most persistent anomalies in human history, the suddenness with which complex societies appear. In Mesopotamia, urban life emerges rapidly around 6,000 years ago, already equipped with writing, law, astronomy, and large-scale architecture. In Egypt, monumental construction begins with extraordinary precision, showing little evidence of a long experimental phase. In the Indus Valley, cities appear fully planned, complete with standardized bricks, drainage systems, and urban zoning from the outset. These civilizations do not resemble hesitant first attempts, they resemble resumptions. The conventional explanation attributes this acceleration to agriculture and population density, yet population growth alone does not account for precision. Writing systems appear structured rather than crude. Mathematical ratios are standardized early. Astronomical calendars show refinement from their earliest known forms. These are not the fingerprints of trial and error. They suggest inheritance filtered through loss. Writing itself illustrates the paradox. The earliest known scripts, such as Sumerian cuneiform and Egyptian hieroglyphs, appear suddenly complex, encoding grammar, abstraction, and symbolic meaning almost immediately. There is little archaeological evidence of a prolonged developmental phase where writing is awkward or incomplete. This has often been explained as rapid innovation. An equally plausible interpretation is re-emergence from mnemonic systems that existed before durable writing materials. Before clay tablets and papyrus, information may have been recorded in perishable forms such as wood, fiber, skin, or entirely oral frameworks reinforced by ritual and architecture. When collapse erased these media, only fragments survived. When stability returned, those fragments were externalized again, creating the illusion of invention rather than recovery. Mathematics follows a similar pattern. Ancient civilizations possessed advanced numerical systems, geometry, and proportions aligned with natural constants. The recurrence of similar ratios across geographically isolated cultures suggests rediscovery rather than coincidence. These proportions appear embedded in architecture and art, implying they were valued for structural and aesthetic reasons long before being symbolically formalized. Astronomy again bridges the gap. Early civilizations did not merely observe the sky, they predicted it. Calendars accounted for leap cycles, eclipses were anticipated, planetary movements were tracked with a consistency that demands long-term data. Such precision cannot be built instantly. It requires records spanning generations, even if those records were later lost or transformed. If such observational archives existed before the oldest surviving civilizations, their disappearance would explain the abrupt gaps followed by rapid reappearance. Knowledge was not created from nothing, it was recovered imperfectly. Trade networks reinforce this interpretation. Even the earliest cities show evidence of long-distance exchange. Lapis lazuli traveled from Afghanistan to Mesopotamia. Obsidian moved across Anatolia. Marine shells reached deep inland. These networks require navigational knowledge, trust systems, and shared standards. Such systems do not arise overnight. They are rebuilt from remembered pathways. Social organization also appears unusually efficient in early civilizations. Legal codes, property concepts, and administrative hierarchies emerge rapidly. These abstractions require shared norms and enforcement mechanisms. They function best when modeled on previous experience rather than invented spontaneously. This framework does not require an uninterrupted global civilization stretching back indefinitely. It requires something more human, repeated attempts at complexity, each constrained by memory loss and environmental reset. Each new civilization begins not at zero, but at whatever baseline survival allows. This explains why later civilizations often mythologize their origins. Founding stories speak of gods, heroes, or civilizing figures who arrive suddenly with knowledge. These figures may represent real survivors or cultural carriers whose understanding exceeded that of the populations they encountered. Over time, their humanity dissolves into legend. It also explains why knowledge often concentrates within elites or priestly classes. When information is scarce and fragile, it is protected through ritual, secrecy, and hierarchy. What begins as preservation eventually becomes power. Collapse disrupts this structure. Elites fall, institutions dissolve, knowledge fragments or disappears. Survivors retain pieces rather than systems. When stability returns, those pieces seed new hierarchies. Seen this way, the long gaps between advanced civilizations are not empty, they are compressions. Humanity contracts into simpler forms capable of surviving scarcity. When conditions allow, expansion resumes. This cycle challenges the narrative of inevitability. Civilization is not guaranteed, it is conditional. It depends on climate stability, ecological balance, and the absence of extreme disruption. When those conditions fail, complexity becomes a liability rather than an advantage. The archaeological record supports this. Periods of cultural florescence align with climatic optima. Periods of fragmentation align with instability. Human capability does not change dramatically across these phases. Opportunity does. This reframes technological firsts. The first city, the first writing, the first calendar may not be first in an absolute sense. They may be the first after forgetting. What appear as origins may be the most recent recoveries. Modern civilization itself is not exempt. It rests on fragile systems, global supply chains, digital infrastructure, centralized knowledge storage. These systems maximize efficiency while minimizing resilience. A sufficiently large disruption could compress humanity once again into simpler modes. If that occurred, much would be lost, but not everything. Biology would persist, myth would persist, stone might persist, the sky would remain unchanged. Survivors would remember patterns even if explanations vanished. In time, complexity would likely return. It always has, not because humanity advances inevitably, but because the capacity to build is older than any single civilization. The lesson embedded across ruins, genes, and stories is not triumph, but caution. Civilization is not a destination reached once. It is a condition that must be continually regained. History does not ask where civilization began. It asks how many times it survived starting over. If civilization is a condition that repeatedly re-emerges, then its survival depends less on invention than on transmission. Each recovery begins with fragments, skills half-remembered, symbols misunderstood, techniques preserved without theory. Over time, these fragments reorganize into systems. What determines whether this happens is not intelligence alone, but continuity of learning under unstable conditions. One of the clearest indicators of this process is apprenticeship. Across ancient cultures, complex skills were not learned abstractly, but through long-term imitation. Stone carving, metallurgy, navigation, and architecture were transmitted person to person, often within family lines or closed guilds. This method of learning is slow but resilient. It survives when writing disappears and institutions collapse. A teacher does not need books to pass on technique, only repetition and memory. This explains why certain crafts appear suddenly advanced when they re-enter the archaeological record. The skill did not evolve rapidly, It survived quietly through lineages that left little material trace. When conditions allowed broader expression, the technique resurfaced fully formed. Metalworking offers a revealing example. The transition from stone to copper, bronze, and iron is often presented as a clean technological ladder. In reality, the record shows long gaps, regional regressions, and abrupt mastery. Smelting requires precise temperature control, understanding of ore behavior, and controlled atmospheres. These are not discoveries made casually, yet early metal artifacts often display remarkable consistency in alloy composition and casting quality. This suggests metallurgical knowledge was not reinvented each time, but selectively preserved. When resources failed or social stability collapsed, metal use declined. When stability returned, the knowledge resurfaced, sometimes under new cultural identities, but with familiar technical fingerprints. Navigation follows a similar pattern. Long-distance sea travel appears repeatedly in deep history, often earlier than expected. Humans reached Australia at least 60,000 years ago, requiring open water crossings. Much later, Polynesian navigators crossed the Pacific using stars, currents, cloud patterns, and wave interference, all without instruments. These systems were learned through embodied practice rather than written theory. Such knowledge is extraordinarily fragile under collapse. Lose the teachers, and the skill vanishes within a generation. This explains why advanced navigation appears episodically in the record. It survives only where social structures protect it. When those structures fail, oceans become barriers again. Agriculture shows the same rhythm. Early farming systems were not simple. They were highly localized, involving crop rotation, soil management, water control, and seasonal timing refined through generations of experimentation. When climate shifted abruptly, many of these systems failed. Survivors reverted to foraging or simplified cultivation, not because agriculture was unknown, but because its complex forms were no longer viable. As stability returned, agriculture re-expanded, sometimes appearing suddenly efficient. This efficiency reflects remembered practice rather than spontaneous innovation. Landscapes remember patterns even when societies forget them. Once conditions align, old solutions resurface. Education itself adapts under pressure. In stable societies, learning becomes abstract, centralized, and specialized. Under stress, it becomes practical, local, and embodied. This oscillation is visible across history. Complex curricula emerge, collapse, and re-emerge in compressed form. What persists are methods that can be learned by doing. This explains why symbolic systems endure longer than explicit explanations. Ritual encodes behavior without theory. Repetition preserves timing without instruction. A ceremony performed annually maintains seasonal awareness even if its original meaning is forgotten. When explanation returns, it builds upon preserved action. Writing, powerful as it is, remains vulnerable. It depends on materials, literacy, and institutional support. When those fail, writing disappears rapidly. Oral systems persist because they require only memory and community. They trade precision for durability, but they survive. The tension between precision and resilience shapes every recovery. Highly optimized systems perform well under stable conditions, but collapse dramatically under stress. Redundant, flexible systems endure but appear inefficient. Early post-collapse societies often look crude, not because they are ignorant, but because they prioritize survivability over refinement. Over time, successful recoveries rebuild institutions of learning, Schools, libraries, and archives appear. Knowledge expands rapidly, yet this expansion carries risk. Centralization increases vulnerability. When collapse returns, the loss is proportionally greater. This cycle helps explain the emotional tone embedded in many ancient traditions. Reverence for ancestors, warnings against hubris, respect for cycles, and suspicion of unchecked innovation recur across cultures. These are not merely moral teachings, they are survival heuristics shaped by long experience. The emphasis on tradition over novelty reflects this memory. Innovation is valuable, but continuity is safer. Societies that forget this balance may grow quickly and fall hard. Those that remember grow slowly and endure longer. Viewed this way, the past is not a series of failed attempts replaced by success. It is a record of adaptation under constraint. Each generation inherits not only tools and stories, but lessons about fragility. Civilization advances when memory and opportunity align. It collapses when either fails. Recovery depends on what remains teachable without infrastructure. The deepest continuity in human history is not technology or architecture. It is learning itself. The ability to pass knowledge person to person, even when systems collapse, is what allows civilization to return. The record of humanity is therefore not written primarily in stone or text, but in hands repeating movements learned long ago. Each recovery begins there. Civilization does not rise from ideas alone. It rises from remembered action. As civilizations recover and learning resumes, another structure consistently reasserts itself: hierarchy. Not as ideology, not as tyranny, but as an organizing response to uncertainty. When survival depends on coordination and memory is unevenly distributed, authority emerges around those who know, manage, or remember more than others. Power does not begin as oppression. It begins as continuity management. In the earliest phases of recovery, leadership is practical. The individual who knows where water remains during drought leads movement. The one who understands seasons directs planting. The builder who remembers how stone behaves organizes construction. Authority flows from competence, not lineage. Decisions are questioned openly because survival depends on accuracy rather than obedience. As conditions stabilize, this balance shifts. Competence becomes reputation. Reputation becomes position. Position becomes inherited. Knowledge narrows. What was once shared through necessity becomes guarded for advantage. Memory, once communal, turns into leverage. This transition appears repeatedly across ancient societies. Priesthoods form as custodians of calendars, astronomy, ritual timing, and law. Their power does not rest initially on force, but on prediction. Knowing when floods arrive, when seasons shift, and when celestial cycles repeat, grants control over food, labor, and belief. In unstable environments, those who claim understanding of cycles wield authority almost automatically. Over time, practical instruction transforms into ritual. Agricultural timing becomes ceremony. Astronomical observation becomes prophecy. Measurement becomes sacred calendar. This shift preserves behavior while obscuring mechanism. What began as empirical knowledge becomes divine ordinance. Questioning it becomes dangerous, not because it is false, but because losing it would be catastrophic. Architecture mirrors this consolidation. Early cities organized themselves around temples, granaries, and administrative centers. These structures dominate space physically and symbolically. They store surplus, records, and standards. Control of architecture becomes control of memory. Whoever controls the center controls coordination. The introduction of writing accelerates this process dramatically. Once information can be recorded externally, it can be centralized. Literacy becomes gatekeeping. Law, trade, contracts, and history fall under those who read and write. Writing stabilizes memory across generations, but it also narrows access. Oral systems distribute knowledge widely but imprecisely. Written systems concentrate knowledge precisely but vulnerably. This concentration increases efficiency while reducing resilience. When collapse occurs, centralized knowledge is lost disproportionately. Archives burn, libraries rot, administrative classes fall first. Survivors are left with fragments, skills detached from explanation, and rituals without origin. Hierarchy amplifies this vulnerability. The more rigid the structure, the more catastrophic its failure. Egalitarian systems endure longer under stress, but scale poorly. Hierarchical systems scale rapidly but fracture violently. Human societies oscillate between these modes in response to environmental pressure rather than philosophy. Economic systems follow the same rhythm. Early recovery favors reciprocity and direct exchange. Trust is personal. Value is tangible. As populations grow, abstraction increases. Currency replaces barter. Contracts replace relationships. Efficiency rises. Fragility follows. When collapse strikes, abstraction fails first. Currency loses meaning. Contracts dissolve. Markets freeze. What remains are skills, relationships, and physical resources. Survivors revert to simpler systems, not out of ignorance, but because complexity no longer serves survival. Religious narratives preserve memory of this cycle. Stories warn against arrogance, excess, and forgetting origins. Myths of golden ages followed by punishment recur globally. These are not abstract moral lessons. They are compressed historical experience framed as ethics. Leadership itself becomes mythologized. Founders are elevated beyond humanity. Kings claim divine descent. Authority becomes unquestionable. This stabilizes order temporarily, but removes feedback. Errors accumulate. When leaders cannot be challenged, collapse accelerates. This dynamic explains why civilizations often fall suddenly after periods of extraordinary achievement. Success breeds overconfidence. Systems optimize for growth rather than resilience. Complexity outpaces adaptability. When disruption arrives, there is no buffer. Recovery begins again from fragments. Hierarchy resets. Knowledge decentralizes. Competence rises from necessity. The cycle repeats not because humans fail to learn, but because learning itself is constrained by memory loss. Understanding this pattern does not diminish ancient accomplishments, it contextualizes them. Cities, empires, monuments, and laws represent peaks within longer oscillations. They are expressions of accumulated memory under favorable conditions, not final achievements. Modern societies exhibit the same structural vulnerabilities. Centralized data, specialized labor, global logistics, and abstract economies maximize productivity but minimize redundancy. Disruption to energy, communication, or coordination cascades rapidly. Efficiency becomes liability. What differs today is scale. The higher the peak, the wider the potential collapse. Yet beneath complexity, the same human capacities persist: cooperation, learning, improvisation, and memory. This suggests collapse is not the opposite of civilization, but a phase of it. What determines survival is not preventing cycles entirely, but limiting their severity. Decentralized knowledge, redundant systems, and teachable skills reduce damage. Ancient emphasis on ritual, tradition, and repetition begins to look strategic rather than superstitious. These practices slow change, preserve continuity, and resist over-optimization. They protect societies from their own efficiency. In a world shaped by recurring disruption, speed becomes dangerous, memory becomes defense, hierarchy must remain flexible, knowledge must circulate rather than concentrate. The lesson preserved across ruins is subtle but consistent. Civilization thrives not by maximizing power, but by balancing expansion with remembrance. Forgetting fragility invites collapse. The remains of the past do not condemn hierarchy or knowledge. They warn against severing them from their purpose. Power without memory becomes destructive. Memory without adaptability becomes brittle. Human history is not a march toward perfection. It is a negotiation with instability. Each generation inherits not certainty, but responsibility. Civilization survives not because it is strong, but because it remembers how to begin again. As hierarchy consolidates and knowledge centralizes, another force quietly reshapes civilization from within: specialization. What begins as efficiency gradually becomes dependence. In stable conditions, specialization allows societies to grow rapidly, producing surplus, innovation, and refinement. Under disruption, the same structure becomes a vulnerability, fracturing systems that rely on uninterrupted coordination. Early human groups were generalists by necessity. Individuals hunted, gathered, built, navigated, and defended. Knowledge was broad, redundant, and shared. This redundancy was inefficient in abundance but invaluable in crisis. When one person failed, another could replace them. Survival depended on overlap. As societies recovered and expanded, specialization emerged naturally. Some focused on farming, others on tool-making, trade, construction, or ritual. Productivity increased, skill deepened, artisanship flourished. Over time, entire classes formed around single functions. This allowed unprecedented complexity, but it also narrowed individual competence. The more specialized a system becomes, the more it depends on uninterrupted exchange. Farmers rely on toolmakers rely on miners rely on transport relies on governance and security. Each layer increases efficiency while multiplying points of failure. Under stable conditions, this network feels invisible. Under stress, it unravels rapidly. The archaeological record captures this fragility. Civilizations that reached high levels of specialization often collapsed abruptly when trade routes failed, climates shifted, or political coordination broke down. The Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE illustrates this clearly. Highly interconnected societies across the Eastern Mediterranean relied on long-distance trade for tin, copper, food, and luxury goods. When disruptions occurred, cities burned, writing vanished, and populations dispersed. Complexity collapsed into simplicity within generations. This collapse was not due to ignorance or laziness, it was structural. Specialized systems cannot contract smoothly. They break. Survivors revert to generalist modes because specialization no longer functions without infrastructure. After collapse, recovery begins with recombination rather than innovation. Survivors adapt what remains. Tools are repurposed. Skills are broadened. Social roles blur. Over time, specialization reemerges cautiously, shaped by memory of fragility. This rhythm appears repeatedly. In the Indus Valley, highly planned cities with standardized systems vanish suddenly, leaving little trace of gradual decline. In Mesoamerica, complex urban centers rose and fell in cycles, often abandoning monumental cores while populations dispersed into smaller, more flexible communities. In each case, collapse did not erase humanity's capacity to rebuild, it reset the structure of dependence. Specialization also shapes knowledge transmission. Highly specialized knowledge is harder to preserve under collapse. If only a few individuals understand a process, their loss erases it entirely. General knowledge spreads more widely and survives longer. This explains why certain technologies vanish for centuries while simpler practices persist. Glassmaking, concrete formulation, and precise metallurgy appear, disappear, and reappear across history. Their survival depends not on brilliance, but on continuity of teaching. When teaching chains break, complexity dissolves. This dynamic creates an illusion of linear progress interrupted by mystery. Technologies seem lost inexplicably, then rediscovered. In reality, they were never guaranteed to persist. They required stable specialization networks that collapsed under stress. Even intellectual specialization follows this pattern. Philosophy, science, and abstract mathematics flourish in stable societies with surplus and leisure. When survival dominates, abstract inquiry recedes, not because minds diminish, but because priorities shift. Knowledge compresses into what is immediately useful. This compression is not loss in absolute terms, it is storage. Ideas are held in latent form, embedded in myth, practice, and simplified models. When conditions allow, abstraction re-emerges, often rapidly. The human brain supports this oscillation. It is capable of extreme focus and broad integration. Under threat, it narrows attention. Under safety, it expands exploration. Civilization mirrors this cognitive rhythm at scale. Modern society represents the most specialized system humanity has ever constructed. Few individuals understand how essential systems function end-to-end. Food, energy, medicine, communication, and finance rely on global coordination. Efficiency is unparalleled. Redundancy is minimal. This configuration maximizes output while minimizing resilience. It assumes continuity. When continuity breaks, recovery depends on how much generalist knowledge remains accessible. Historical collapses suggest that societies which preserve broad competence alongside specialization recover faster. Those that externalize all knowledge into institutions recover slower or not at all. This insight reframes the value of tradition, craft, and manual skill. Practices dismissed as obsolete often carry resilience. They preserve the ability to function without infrastructure. They are not romantic holdovers. They are backups. Ancient cultures often balance specialization with ritualized redundancy. Multiple groups tracked time independently. Knowledge was encoded in story, architecture, and practice simultaneously. This redundancy reduced efficiency but increased survivability. As civilizations matured, they often abandoned redundancy in favor of optimization. The result was brilliance followed by brittleness. Collapse, then, is not merely destruction, it is rebalancing. It strips away over-specialization, forcing humanity back into configurations capable of enduring uncertainty. From this perspective, collapse performs a regulatory function, however brutal. This does not diminish its cost. Lives are lost. Knowledge fragments. Trauma accumulates. But from a long view, collapse reshapes civilization toward survivability. Recovery begins when specialization re-emerges slowly, guided by memory or fragility. The most enduring societies are those that never forget how quickly complexity can vanish. This pattern challenges the belief that progress must always accelerate. Acceleration increases risk. Sustainability depends on pacing. Human history suggests that intelligence alone does not guarantee continuity. Structure matters, balance matters. Remembering how to live without complexity matters most of all. Civilization is not defined by how much it can build, but by how gracefully it can lose and rebuild without forgetting itself. The past does not warn against knowledge or specialization. It warns against forgetting the cost of dependence. Every collapse leaves behind the same lesson, written not in text, but in absence. What cannot be done alone will not survive disruption. Those who endure are those who remember how to become whole again. As specialization fractures under collapse and societies revert to generalist survival, another transformation quietly unfolds, the reshaping of identity itself. When complex systems dissolve, people no longer define themselves primarily by profession, status, or institution. Identity compresses around kinship, place, and shared memory. This shift is not ideological or romantic, it is adaptive. In highly developed civilizations, identity is layered. Individuals belong simultaneously to occupations, cities, legal systems, belief frameworks, and abstract political categories. These layers depend on continuity and enforcement. When collapse disrupts coordination, most layers evaporate quickly. What remains are the most ancient and resilient bonds: family, immediate community, and landscape. The archaeological record reflects this contraction clearly. After major collapses, dense urban centers are abandoned in favor of smaller, dispersed settlements. Architecture simplifies. Monumental construction disappears. Burials become local rather than ceremonial. Art becomes portable. Identity narrows to what can move, be remembered, and be defended. To later observers, this often appears as cultural decline. In reality, it is cultural preservation under constraint. Large identities require infrastructure and administration. Small identities require memory and trust. When infrastructure fails, trust becomes the primary currency of survival. Language reveals this process with precision. After collapse, linguistic diversity often increases. Centralized administrative languages fragment into regional dialects. Writing systems vanish. Oral traditions multiply. This is not decay. It is decentralization. Language adapts to smaller social units where direct communication matters more than standardization. These dialects frequently preserve older linguistic features that were lost in centralized forms. Sounds, grammatical structures, and expressions endure because they remain embedded in daily use rather than imposed from authority. Collapse, in this sense, acts as a linguistic time capsule, preserving deep patterns while shedding administrative excess. Myth and story adapt alongside identity. Grand cosmologies tied to empires give way to local narratives anchored in specific landscapes, ancestors, and events. Universal gods retreat. Place-based spirits emerge. Sacred mountains, rivers, forests, and caves replace imperial pantheons, meaning anchors to geography because geography remains when institutions do not. This localization of belief is not regression, it is recalibration. Large belief systems require consensus and enforcement. Local belief requires shared experience. After collapse, shared experience is all that remains reliable. Genetic evidence mirrors this pattern. Population bottlenecks followed by regional isolation increase genetic differentiation. Communities adapt tightly to local environments, traits favoring cooperation, mobility, and environmental awareness become more pronounced. These adaptations do not erase broader human potential. They preserve it under new constraints. Over time, as conditions stabilize, these localized identities begin to reconnect, trade resumes, marriage networks expand, stories merge, languages borrow from one another, identity layers rebuild. What was once local becomes regional, then expansive again. This rebuilding is never exact. Each cycle reshapes identity differently. Old categories do not return unchanged. New boundaries form. Memory guides reconstruction, but forgetting alters direction. This explains why civilizations with similar technological levels can appear culturally distinct. They are not separate inventions. They are recoveries shaped by different survival paths. Identity compression also reshapes values. Under abundance, societies celebrate innovation, expansion, and individual achievement. Under scarcity, values shift toward continuity, restraint, and collective responsibility. These are not moral preferences. They are survival strategies encoded through experience. Ancient legal traditions reflect this shift. Early laws emphasize kin obligation, restitution, and shared responsibility. Later systems emphasize property, contract, and individual rights. Neither framework is inherently superior. Each aligns with environmental stability or instability. Collapse reactivates older value systems, not because societies become nostalgic, but because those systems function better under uncertainty. Obligation replaces entitlement. Memory replaces abstraction. The rhythm of identity contraction and expansion repeats throughout history. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, Europe fragmented into localized identities centered on kin, village, and land. Over centuries, these identities reconnected into larger political forms. Similar patterns followed the collapse of the Maya, the Indus Valley, and Bronze Age Mediterranean societies. What persists through these shifts is not political structure, but narrative continuity. Origin stories adapt to new scales. Heroes become ancestors. Ancestors become symbols. Identity survives because it is told, not enforced. This storytelling serves another function. It transmits memory of collapse without naming it directly. Tales of lost golden ages, wandering ancestors, and sacred homelands encode disruption. They teach caution without requiring historical records. As societies rebuild, these narratives provide cohesion where institutions are weak. They define belonging in the absence of law. They answer the question that matters most after collapse: who belongs together? Modern societies often underestimate this function, treating identity as a social construct rather than a survival mechanism. Yet under stress, identity reorganizes rapidly, revealing its deeper purpose. It identifies who can be trusted when systems fail. This perspective reframes conflict as well. Many historical conflicts arise not from irrational hostility, but from overlapping recoveries. Groups rebuilding from different fragments carry different memories. When they meet, misalignment occurs. Conflict becomes negotiation over whose memory guides reconstruction. Over time, synthesis occurs. Identities blend. New narratives emerge. Civilization expands again. The danger arises when expanding societies forget the adaptive origins of identity and attempt to impose uniformity too quickly. Centralized identity may increase efficiency, but reduce resilience. Diversity, though complex, preserves options. Ancient societies often maintained multiple identity layers deliberately. Local customs coexisted with imperial systems. Ritual variation was tolerated. This redundancy acted as cultural insurance. When empires fell, local identity remained intact. Collapse strips identity down to its core, not to erase it, but to protect it. What cannot survive at small scale will not survive at all. Seen through this lens, identity is not a fixed attribute. It is a dynamic tool shaped by pressure. It contracts to endure and expands to build. Civilization depends not on rigid sameness, but on identity flexible enough to survive loss without dissolving entirely. The deep past suggests that humanity's strength lies not in uniformity, but in the ability to rebuild connection from fragments without erasing difference. What survives collapse is not empire or ideology, but belonging. From belonging, everything else grows again. As identity rebuilds and societies reconnect, another force quietly determines whether recovery stabilizes or collapses again: memory of risk. Civilizations do not fail simply because they forget the past. They fail because they remember selectively. Comfort dulls caution. Success reframes danger as myth. Over time, lessons earned through collapse are softened, reinterpreted, or ignored until conditions repeat. In the earliest phases of recovery, risk awareness is high. Communities organize defensively. Settlements avoid floodplains. Food systems diversify. Redundancy is valued over efficiency. Knowledge is shared broadly because survival depends on collective competence. These behaviors are not moral virtues. They are responses to lived threat. As generations pass without major disruption, this vigilance erodes. Memories of collapse become stories rather than experience. Stories become symbols. Symbols become ceremony. What once functioned as instruction becomes tradition, then culture, then nostalgia. The original warning fades while the form remains. This erosion is visible in settlement patterns. Early post-collapse communities favor higher ground, dispersed housing, and access to multiple resources. As stability persists, populations drift back toward fertile floodplains, coastlines, and trade hubs. These locations offer abundance and connectivity but carry known risks. Memory acknowledges the risk. Confidence dismisses it. The same pattern unfolds in food systems. Early recovery emphasizes diversity, mixed crops, foraging, storage, and seasonal flexibility. Over time, specialization increases, monoculture spreads, efficiency rises, vulnerability follows. When disruption returns, failure is sudden and widespread. Ancient civilizations repeatedly demonstrate this arc. In Mesopotamia, early agricultural systems balanced irrigation with fallow cycles. As population pressure grew, over-irrigation salinized soil, reducing yields and increasing dependence on centralized control. Risk was known. Short-term stability overruled long-term caution. In the Maya lowlands, early cities managed water through dispersed reservoirs and landscape adaptation. Later expansions centralized water control, amplifying productivity but reducing resilience. Prolonged droughts triggered rapid collapse. The knowledge to adapt existed. The willingness to maintain redundancy had faded. This selective forgetting extends beyond material systems into governance. Early leadership after collapse tends to be flexible, accountable, and pragmatic. As institutions mature, authority hardens, feedback weakens, leaders begin to believe in permanence. Warning signs are reframed as anomalies rather than signals. Religious and philosophical systems often encode early caution. Cycles of rise and fall are acknowledged. Impermanence is emphasized. Over time, these teachings are softened to support stability. Collapse narratives become symbolic rather than practical. Risk becomes abstract. Even architecture reflects this shift. Early structures prioritize durability and adaptability. Later monuments prioritize scale and prestige. They assume continuity. When disruption arrives, the structures remain, but the societies around them fail. This is not because ancient peoples were naive, it is because humans adapt emotionally as well as intellectually. Living under constant threat is exhausting. When danger recedes, societies naturally prioritize comfort and expansion. Risk awareness declines not through ignorance, but through relief. The problem arises when relief outlasts memory. When generations grow up without experiencing collapse, caution appears unnecessary. Redundancy looks wasteful, efficiency becomes virtue. Those who warn of fragility are dismissed as pessimists. This cycle is not unique to the past. Modern societies exhibit the same dynamics. Infrastructure is optimized, supply chains are streamlined, systems are engineered for peak performance rather than failure tolerance. Redundancy is cut to reduce cost. Risk is externalized or ignored. The difference today is scale and speed. Highly interconnected systems propagate failure rapidly. What once collapsed regionally now collapses globally. Memory of risk has not disappeared. It has been overshadowed by confidence in control. Historical evidence suggests that civilizations capable of sustaining themselves longer than average share one trait: institutionalized remembrance of fragility. This remembrance takes many forms: rotating leadership, distributed authority, ritual reminders of loss, architectural restraint, legal limits on expansion. In ancient Japan, seismic risk-shaped construction methods emphasizing flexibility rather than mass. In Andean societies, agricultural terraces preserved soil and water under extreme conditions. In parts of Africa, oral traditions preserved environmental memory guiding migration and land use. These practices endured because they remained useful. When such practices were abandoned in favor of external models promising efficiency, collapse followed. The lesson was not that innovation failed, but that innovation unanchored from local memory increased risk. Civilizations that endure longest do not eliminate danger, they normalize it. They design systems expecting disruption. They treat collapse not as impossibility, but as a condition to be mitigated. This perspective reframes resilience. Resilience is not strength alone, it is humility encoded into structure. It is the refusal to believe that success equals safety. Collapse often returns not because knowledge is lost, but because it is discounted. Warnings are known, patterns are visible, but belief shifts. The future is assumed to resemble the recent past rather than the deep one. The deep past tells a different story. Stability is temporary, disruption is normal. Complexity must be defended continuously against its own excess. Civilization survives longest when it remembers that it is not the first attempt, that others rose, optimized, believed, and fell. That memory is not a burden, but protection. Forgetting collapse does not make it less likely. It makes it faster. Every ruin is a reminder not of ignorance, but of confidence outlasting caution. The stone does not warn loudly, it endures silently. The lesson carried forward is not to fear progress, but to anchor it, not to reject efficiency, but to balance it, not to dwell on collapse, but to plan for it openly. Civilization is not fragile because humans are flawed. It is fragile because success encourages forgetting. What endures is not brilliance, but restraint shaped by memory. The past does not demand reverence. It demands attention. When the fragments of history are assembled without the expectation of a single beginning or a permanent ascent, a different picture settles into place. Humanity appears not as a species stumbling blindly towards civilization, but as one repeatedly arriving there, losing it, and returning again with altered memory. What survives each cycle is not achievement, but orientation, not the height reached, but the direction remembered. Across deep time, the same pattern reasserts itself. Environmental stability allows complexity to bloom. Networks expand, knowledge specializes, identity stretches outward, memory of danger fades, then disruption arrives, indifferent to belief or preparation. Systems fracture. Complexity collapses inward. Survivors retreat into smaller, more flexible forms. What remains is not ignorance, but compression. From that compression, recovery begins. Skills resurface through hands and habit. Stories reassemble meaning. Stone preserves alignment. The body carries adaptation. Civilization reforms not because it was invented again, but because it was never fully erased. Each return is shaped by what was lost and what endured. This perspective dissolves the false comfort of linear history. There is no final stage, no guaranteed permanence. Civilization is not a trophy secured by progress. It is a balance maintained against forgetting. The ruins scattered across the planet are not monuments to failure. They are evidence of repetition. What distinguishes one cycle from another is not intelligence, morality, or worth. It is scale, speed, and memory. Earlier societies collapsed regionally. Modern civilization is global. Earlier knowledge was embedded locally. Modern knowledge is centralized and abstract. Earlier collapses left survivors who could still see the sky, work the land, and teach one another directly. Modern collapse risks severing those connections simultaneously. Yet the same foundations remain. Human adaptability has not diminished. Cooperation still arises under pressure. Learning still transmits through practice. Memory still compresses into story when systems fail. The capacity to rebuild remains older than any technology layered upon it. The lesson of deep history is not pessimism, it is responsibility. To understand that civilization has ended before is not to surrender to inevitability, it is to recognize conditions. Stability is rare. Resilience must be cultivated deliberately. Efficiency must be tempered by redundancy. Expansion must be anchored by remembrance. The past does not argue against complexity, it argues against forgetting the cost of complexity. Every system optimized for growth must also be designed for interruption. Every concentration of knowledge must be matched by circulation. Every monument must be paired with memory that outlives it. Ancient societies encoded these lessons imperfectly. They used myth, ritual, stone, and tradition to warn future generations without knowing who those generations would be. Much of that meaning was lost, softened, or misread. Yet enough survived to be recognized when patterns repeated. Modern society possesses unprecedented tools, but faces the same constraints. Climate instability, ecological strain, and systemic interdependence mirror pressures that shaped past collapses. The difference is not awareness, but response. Knowledge exists. The question is whether it is acted upon before memory fades again. The record suggests that collapse is not caused by lack of information, but by delayed humility. Societies fall when they assume continuity rather than plan for disruption. They recover when they remember how to live without guarantees. If there is a central assumption worth carrying forward, it is this: civilization is not separate from nature. It is nested within it. When conditions shift, civilization must shift with them or fracture. The more rigid the structure, the sharper the break. The deep past offers no prophecy, only precedent. It shows that humanity has endured far worse than forgetting names or losing cities. It has survived ice, fire, flood, and silence. What it did not survive easily was certainty. Certainty encourages overreach. Overreach invites collapse. Collapse resets the scale. Memory rebuilds what certainty destroyed. To see ourselves as the first advanced civilization is to misunderstand the evidence. To see ourselves as the last is to misunderstand humanity. We are one expression in a long sequence of recoveries, carrying both inherited wisdom and inherited risk. What matters now is not whether the cycle can be stopped, but whether its impact can be softened, whether knowledge can be decentralized without being diluted, whether identity can remain flexible without dissolving, whether progress can proceed without erasing the memory that makes it survivable. The past does not offer solutions ready-made. It offers orientation. It shows where others stood when they believed permanence had arrived. It shows what they built, what they forgot, and what remained after belief failed. Stone still aligns with the sky. Stories still warn of flood and fire. The body still adapts. Learning still passes hand to hand. These are not relics, they are instructions. Civilization does not need to be abandoned to be preserved. It needs to be remembered as conditional. It needs to be treated as something maintained, not possessed. In the end, the deepest continuity is not progress, but return. Humanity has always come back from the edge, not by recreating the past exactly, but by carrying forward what mattered most. What remains is not the certainty that collapse will not come, but the quieter knowledge that beginning again has never been beyond us. History does not end. It pauses, fragments, and resumes. The question left by the deep past is not whether civilization will fall again, but what will still be remembered when it does, and whether that memory will be enough to guide the next return.